This week's episode is about the study of sociology. Sociology is the study of human interaction or individuals as members of a group. Many students take a first-year sociology course unsure what it is about and may even leave the course confused or overwhelmed by the breadth of information and topics that can be researched in the field of sociology. In particular, students coming out of high school may be unfamiliar with the use of theories and methodologies to conduct research and write papers. This week's guest is Jemimah Amos, PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Windsor and Pfau academic writing coach and editor. Her academic and research interests include migration, race and ethnicity, feminism, and qualitative methodologies. She is also an academic tutor and graduate assistant in the Department of Sociology at the University of Windsor, working closely with students to improve their understanding of course materials, assignment delivery, and essay writing. Jemimah moved to Canada from Lagos, Nigeria in 2017. She enjoys reading, traveling, brainstorming, and watching movies. Welcome to our podcast, Breathe In, Write Out, Jemimah.
Thank you, Lisa.
So tell us a little bit, and I don't even know if I ever took a sociology course. I think maybe I didn't. I don't know. But I always wanted to. But so can you tell us a little bit about your journey to doing a PhD in Canada and what drew you to sociology in particular?
Okay. My undergraduate my degree was also in sociology. My master's was in sociology. My PhD is in sociology. So I've been doing sociology all my life. At the time when I was going into undergraduate school, I had 3 options of schools, and I picked the one farthest from home. And then it was time to pick what to study, and I had no idea.
Okay.
I was an art student, and so the counselor called me and said how there was this course he heard about, and it was really interesting, and it was about the study of human society. He gave a very broad description,
Okay.
and at the time, I really didn't know what it was. I think that was my first time even hearing the term sociology.
Okay.
And I just thought, okay, you know what? The school I was going to was relatively new, so we didn't have a lot of options in terms of courses available or different things available. So I said, okay, fine. It sounds like something I would be interested in. And so I said, okay, I'll do sociology, and I went. And my first semester was really my introduction to sociology, if you would call it that. And let's just say the rest is history. I became very much interested in it. And early on, I figured out how to do sociology or how to write sociology. And then I realized I was really interested in sociology and went on to do a master's. And after I came here 2017 to do my master's.
Okay. So
even
your undergrad was in Nigeria?
Yes, my undergrad was in Nigeria, and I came and I did my master's. And one of the things that was very interesting was being able to bring, I would say, a Nigerian perspective.
Right.
So say even in the things that we were taught, it's the same sociology, but the way it was taught in Nigeria and the way it was taught here are quite different. And so one of the things that I always did in my master's class was to bring examples and tell people how it's well, first of all, it's a very different society than it is here.
Right.
So being able to bring that perspective of what sociology was like in Nigeria and what sociology is here,
right,
was something unique. And I would always, every opportunity I have, I would talk about Lagos. And there was a time in class I said how the population of Lagos alone was about 21 million.
Wow.
And I remember everyone being astonished. And to me, it was like, oh, it's no big deal. Like, I grew up in Lagos and I grew up around 21 million people. And and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So so my master's here, and for my undergraduate degree, my thesis was I examined the dual roles of women. So the idea of women being workers and also being mothers, and how there was a need to find a balance between the two roles, and how that would affect job performance. And it was a really interesting project.
So I'm interested. You're studying a similar thing now, right? In your PhD.
Yes.
How did your perspective change when you came to Canada on that particular topic, or did it?
Yeah, so that was also something very interesting about my journey. Studying sociology in the Nigerian context, I was very particular about the girl-child education. It was an issue I really wanted to, like, when I wrote my statement of interest, I was talking about how I really wanted to solve the problem of the girl-child education. But on arrival to Canada, I realized that it was a very different society, and some issues that seemed important in a Nigerian context weren't as problematic here.
Like what?
Like the girl-child education, for instance, like early child marriage and things like that.
Oh, okay.
And so I had to start thinking of ways to apply myself. I had to start thinking of problems in the Canadian society that I could still relate to, and I could still apply my knowledge of feminism, because that's what I was really interested in at the time. And so I started thinking of my life and just observing. And then the idea of immigrant women in the Canadian labor force came to, I mean, at the time I had just come, I was probably looking for a job, and the reality of being an immigrant and trying to find a job, and the obstacles and the barriers and all those things just kind of pushed me in that direction. And I started doing more research, and of course I took classes, and I would write all my papers, I would relate all my papers to African immigrant women and try to explore their experiences here in Canada. And first of all, there aren't a lot of studies that have been conducted on that group of people. And as a recently emerging immigrant group, so in terms of the number of people coming in, there's an influx and it's rising. And I think that group needs to be examined. So that kind of shifted my interest in a way that I'm still able to do feminist work, but it's something that addresses an issue in the Canadian context.
Right, interesting. So it sounds like all through your studies, what you're interested in researching was very personal. Yes. I imagine like even your undergraduate topic in Nigeria is personal because you're a girl, educated. I don't know exactly what that would be about, because I'm coming from the Canadian context, but it sounds like at each step your personal experience is informing your research. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that's very correct. That's very correct. And it's because all through my academic career, I've always explored things that I'm very interested in. I tell people how in this work that we do, passion is important, interest is important, because it can become tiresome, and if you don't have real interest in a particular topic, it's very easy to forget why you're doing something. So when I pick something that I'm passionate about, or something that is personal to me, I'm very much interested in seeing it through.
Right.
Yeah, so that's just been it for me.
So interesting. I think that was kind of true of me. I mean, I don't know if it's about my personal experience, but I don't know. I was just very interested in China and Chinese politics, and the more I knew Chinese people and went to China and all these things, my interest grew, and it'd be about like my experiences when I went to China. So I noticed one time in the airport some announcement about like HIV, and so I wrote a paper on. I got curious about like what's their policy on HIV prevention and what's happening for people and stuff like that. And then another time, like the housing prices were changing, and people were talking about property rights and then the concept of that in North America versus in communist China is very different. So I think that's interesting, and that's actually like a really good takeaway for students, is to write about things that not only interest you, but you have some personal connection to or lived experience, because I think that can give you a unique perspective. I know when I was in Canada studying Chinese politics, I'd never been to China. I was always fascinated by it as a child. But once I went to China and I came back and did my master's degree, my perspective totally changed, because what you read in a book and what you see in the field is really different. And it's a bit different for me because I have to be aware of like my lens. Like I'm not Chinese. There's things I would experience differently than if I was a native person from China coming over studying Chinese politics. They would have a different perspective.
Yes.
So that's really interesting and something to note. So I did my degree in political sociology, never actually sociology, because I was interested in like the behavior of people, but within political context. What do you think is the difference between sociology and other social sciences like, political science, psychology, economics? How does sociology fit in?
Okay. What I'm trying to briefly explain, first of all, I would explain what sociology is just broadly, and then try to make out differences between sociology and other social science disciplines. Mm-hmm. When I try to explain what sociology is, if I'm trying to be brief, I just say it's a science that studies how people interact as members of a society. Mm-hmm. It attempts to explain and understand the behavior of human beings in society. Mm-hmm. And quite often people conflate psychology and sociology. So I would tell someone,
yeah, for sure,
I'm studying sociology, and they would say, maybe after spending a while with them, they would say, oh, can you tell me about myself? Or can you predict my behavior? Or and they would say some funny thing.
Yeah.
And I would say, okay, psychology studies individuals as a single unit, while sociology studies people as members of a group. But that's also rather a very simplified explanation.
Yeah. Because psychology also does generalize across groups, right? Like men have a more tendency to this compared to women, or certain racial or cultural groups might, I don't know, respond to some like when they're doing when they're in the lab, they're controlling for these variables or trying to isolate a certain variable, but it's different. Yeah, I think that is actually confusing. Like I'm still actually like a little bit confused. So what would be the difference between that and sociology? Like, if we think of a question, how would someone studying psychology and someone studying sociology approach, say, like the thing you're interested in studying?
So compared to psychology, sociology is much less concerned with the individual.
Okay.
But so emphasis would be on humans in groups, and then a major difference is the size of groups studied in sociology can vary considerably. So ranging from studies of gangs, just delinquent gangs, to studies of entire institutions, such as the healthcare, to studies of whole societies. For example, you have studies conducted on the British society, or even the entire globe. So say, I mean, and I don't want to speak for psychologists, but if, say, my topic of my topic of immigrant women,
right,
a psychologist might approach it differently in terms of focusing on the individual, like individual traits, individual behaviors, while I, as a sociologist, will be considering the impact of social structures. So, for instance, the employment sector.
Right.
How does that affect people as groups? So it's not now necessarily about myself as an individual and what I'm able to do or what I'm not able to do. It's more about how the society, how I interact with my society, and how the society also influences my life, my behavior, my experiences. But then it's not just about one individual person. It's about people as members of a group.
My perception would be a psychologist, for example, might be interested in the stress or the psychological impact of being an immigrant mother full-time employed in Canada compared to a non-immigrant mother full-time employed in Canada. Like, those would actually be two groups. But I think the psychologist would be more interested in like what's the psychological impact? Like how does this affect the individual, as you said?
Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas you would be more interested in how, like, maybe when you arrive in the country, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And we're not even talking about an individual, right? So how different institutions shape a certain group's, like the group, working immigrant mothers, even from a subsection of the world, right? How the institutions shape their experience. Would that be accurate?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Another difference, so unlike some social sciences like economics, sociology does not define or doesn't confine itself to one area of social life. I say how sociology is as broad as anything. So in sociology, we study a vast and diverse range of topics. There's sociology of music, there's sexuality, there's religion, families, migration, colonialism, crime and exclusion, there's sociology of sport, there's health, there's sociology of law, just anything you can think of. It's hard to think of any significant area of social life that has never been the subject of a sociological study. So it's diverse. It's as diverse as you can imagine. So that's also something that differentiates sociology from other social science disciplines.
Interesting. No wonder students get overwhelmed.
It can be. So usually what we do is at the undergraduate level, I think you're introduced to a broad overview. But say if you want to do a master's, you need to find an area of specialization, and focus, because it's broad. You can't possibly do like a very broad overview, a broad study. You have to find an area and then specialize in that area. For instance, I've chosen migration studies. Someone else can pick religion and secularization. Someone else can pick race and ethnicity. Someone else can pick. So it's broad.
Wow, how do they organize this a department? Because in political science, there's always there's international relations. Every department's going to have international relations. Every department's going to have, if I'm in Canada, Canadian politics, if I'm in the US, American politics, whatever your country's politics, some domestic course. Every department's going to have political theory, and every department's going to have comparative politics, which can be very, in a way, sort of like social. You can talk about all kinds of stuff in comparative politics. How the heck? I mean, maybe this sort of brings me to the question of like theorists, or like how, like, what would an intro sociology course look like? How is it different in every single university? How do they sort of bring this broad discipline together so that everyone has the same foundation?
That's really interesting, because when I was surprised when I came to Windsor and I found out that women's and gender studies was a department on its own.
Oh, okay.
So I always thought it would be lumped up in sociology, but it has an entire, like, it's an entire department on its own.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways that they try to but bringing us,
that's actually, but isn't that different than how you look at to me, women and gender studies is different than feminism in other areas. No, like, it's kind of developed, as you said, it's developed into its own discipline. It's not necessarily just sociology. But okay, interesting point.
Right. Yeah, right. But what I mean is, before coming here, I always thought, so in my undergraduate program, they were all lumped together as sociology.
Oh, wow, that's even more.
So yeah, exactly. And then I came here and it's like, okay, there's this whole separate department that handles women and gender issues solely as, and that's not to say that there aren't overlaps, right? Because I mean, that's what we're saying. There are overlaps, right, but it's big enough to be a department on its own.
Yeah. Well, that's like at the University of Toronto, they have, in the education department, they are more likely to be sub things, you know, like Black studies or Indigenous studies, which exactly. I guess may have traditionally maybe been under sociology. I don't know, it's all very confusing.
Yeah.
So let's kind of get back to, if I was a first year student in an intro sociology class at Windsor or University of Saskatchewan or University of British Columbia or Yale, would I be studying similar stuff in my first year foundational course? Are there some key texts that pretty much every first year course is going to draw upon and get students to be familiarized with, or it could be totally different?
No, absolutely. And I think so you made examples from Canadian universities, but I think even my undergraduate experience, my intro to sociology, to a very large extent, I can make comparisons to what is being taught here.
Okay.
And I mean, that brings us to the topic of theorists and major theorists in sociology, because that's usually a good introduction into sociology. We have three main canons, so three main people. We have Karl Marx, we have Emily Durkheim, and we have Max Weber. Now, so a sociological theory is a set of ideas that claim to explain how society or aspects of society work, right? So as a basic introduction, I would just provide a simplified and condensed explanation. We have functionalism, which is one of the main ones. And in explaining functionalism, an analogy is drawn from biology. So society is likened to an organism that has various parts, and all the parts must function independently, but also together for the survival of the whole organism. So likewise, our society, or society as studied in sociology, has various institutions. We have the family, we have the educational system, we have the religious system, we have the economic system, which must all perform their individual functions to maintain stability, what we call stability, and what we call equilibrium of the society. Now, all these parts are interrelated, and when put together, they form a complete functioning system. That's the general idea of
that's you always study functionalism. Was that
it's like the first one.
Does that come from the three canons, or was that developed later? So you got Weber, Marx, and Durkheim, which you always see in the text. You always see in the textbook, right? So is functionalism associated with one of them, or is that much later? I thought that was like later, like more like the 50s. I don't know. You can correct me. When does functionalism come about?
Influential theories in functionalism include Emily Durkheim. So he's one of the, you can't talk about functionalism without talking about him. We also have other theories too prominent, like Talcott Parsons and Robert K. Martin. But what's really interesting about functionalists is that they emphasize the importance of value consensus in society. However, they recognize that conflicts can occur. And that brings us to the next major theoretical perspective, which is conflict theories. Now, for conflict theories, people usually talk about Marxism first, and there you have Karl Marx. Right?
Yeah,
and so
society is one giant conflict, one giant power struggle.
Yes.
Two
exactly. Yes, that's a very broad, but yes, for someone who is just getting introduced to Marxism, that's a very nice way to introduce that topic. So for conflict theories, they hold that there are fundamental differences of interest between social groups, and these differences result in conflicts being a common and a persistent feature of society, and not something temporary, as the functionalists had tried to initially put forth. Right? So we have, for the sake of being simple, like I said, we have Marxism, majorly influenced by the writings of the German philosopher. He was an economics, he was a sociologist, a political theorist, Karl Marx. We also have Max Weber. He's also a notable conflict theorist. And then somehow feminism is classified as a conflict theory.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So that you see how that would also be there, because
what about like critical race theory?
Yes.
Conflict theory.
So those are. But remember how we're trying to do like the big guys. Kind of an introduction. So things like critical race theory are things you would learn down the line. It may be mentioned in an introductory course, but not necessarily in full details.
Right. But I think what you're getting at is that there's three main theorists, there's a few key theories, and then in a way people are almost spinning off of a certain theory and making it more specific, like feminism versus conflict theory, or challenging an existing theory, right? So conflict theory comes from challenging functionalism.
Yes.
So
and it continues like that.
Yeah, which could be quite overwhelming for a student who is young and trying to understand the world, and then discovering like, what do you mean there's like all these different ways to understand the same problem, like
so what I would say is okay, let me just talk about the last major one, and then I would go on to explain how I handled that complexity as an undergraduate student. So the last major one, so to say, is symbolic interactionism. So that's more concerned with the action between individuals, and it begins from the assumption that action is meaningful to those involved, so it's symbolic. It therefore follows that an understanding of action requires an interpretation of the meanings that the actors give to their activities. So actions are not meaningless. There's a reason why we do things that we do, and our actions affect how we interact with people. So for symbolic interactionism, we have theorists like George Herbert Mead, we have Charles Cooley, those are major people that you would hear about, and the concept of the looking glass self. Additionally, we have someone called Auguste Comte, who is actually credited with inventing the term sociology. I mean, there are debates around that, but for the sake of this, we would just say that. And he's regarded as one of the founders of the discipline. We also have someone called C. Wright Mills, who is also important, and his idea of the concept of the sociological imagination. And it just means that there is the understanding of the relationship between individuals and their social context. So between biography and history. Again, you're not just looking at individuals as single units, but the relationship between individuals and their social context.
Wow. I'm already getting kind of lost. So I think there's a lot to read.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Just to sort of recap, why don't you recap like the three major authors and the three major theories, just the terminology so that someone could look it up if they're interested in this. And then and then how do you distill this?
So major theorists would be Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Major theories: functionalism, conflict, symbolic interactionism. And as an undergraduate student, what I did was I didn't necessarily have, say, all the knowledge about theories, but I knew just enough to be able to distinguish between each one. And say, and they do this thing in sociology where they give you a very broad and vague question and you can really address it from any angle, right? Yeah. So what I would do is I would take whatever question it is and try to, so if you're looking at families, for instance, or the nature of families, a functionalist perspective will be focused on how in a family as a unit, you have the father, you have the mother, you have the children, you have whoever, and together they form a whole unit. And with everybody performing their individual functions, the family is stable, the family is able to function properly, right? That's a very simplistic functionalist theory, but it works. Now, a conflict perspective would say no, but families aren't always that functional. You have dysfunctional families. You have conflict arising when someone thinks the role that society has assigned to them isn't what they should do, right? That's a conflict perspective. A rejection of gender roles, for example. That's a very simplistic way of explaining it. But again, it works, especially at the introductory level. You're not trying to overwhelm yourself with all these theories and all these different angles and all these things that they've said. So if you take a functionalist perspective and you explain it the way that I have explained it, but you go ahead to say that there are limitations to the way that functionalists have presented the idea of a family, and you go ahead to say that sometimes things aren't always that stable. We have divorce. That's a way of taking something very simple and you're still keeping it simple because you observe families around you, and there's conflict, right? So that's a very simple way of merging both theories and not overwhelming yourself with all the details and all the so that's one way, and that's usually how I do it, or how I did it then.
So I think what you're saying is learn from the textbook, the lecture, whatever, the key components of each theory, then take a social institution or something that you're familiar with, like family. All of us have some sort of family. And then apply the theory to, like, each theory to that thing, such as family. And that would help you to understand the difference between the theories, the strengths and weaknesses of the theories. So that's a good way to digest things and not get too complicated, but just really kind of get the basics.
Exactly.
Okay. So I think, so theory is really, this is something, even when I have a PhD student that I'm coaching still, like, this is a thing people struggle with. Like, what is theory? How do I use it in a paper? Why do I need a theory? You know, so why can't I just write about families? So how does that sort of show up in sociology when you sort of talked about, say, an exam, but an assignment, how does the theory show up? How do I apply it? And then I think another thing people get confused about is, what is the difference between theory and method? I think in a way people have an easier time, like, here's how I'm going to attack a question, a research question. But why do I have two sections, a theory section, a methodology section? Maybe you can talk a little bit about. I asked you a lot of things all at once, but
yeah, I'm trying to, and it's a lot. I'm trying to unpack and not forget. But okay, as I said earlier, so very broadly, a theory is a set of ideas that provides an explanation for the way things are in our society, right? So as sociologists, we use theories as an attempt to understand the nature and complexity of society. And these ideas that we have must be tested. So that's where we start talking about methodology. It involves ways of producing and analyzing data so that theories can be tested, accepted, or rejected. So methodology, I would say, is concerned with both the detailed research methods through which data is collected and the more general philosophies upon which the collection and analysis of data are based. I will give an example soon to just clarify everything and make it really simple. But within sociology, we have two very broad definitions or traditions of methodology. We have quantitative and qualitative, and I'm sure this is something you've come across.
Right.
So for quantitative methodology, data is collected in numerical forms, usually through means like surveys and questionnaires. While for qualitative data, they're usually represented in forms of words, collected through means like interviews, focus groups, participant observation, and ethnographies, right? Now, in recent years, some sociologists have questioned the need for such rigid division because it's almost as if you do quantitative, you can't do qualitative. But then we have a mixed methods approach where you're able to combine both. Now, I'll just give an example that I think ties everything up nicely. When you're writing a paper on, let's pick a topic, let's say gender-based violence, right?
Okay.
Now, feminist theories as a theory and the concept of patriarchy is really important in that it can inform and provide an explanation to what you're studying. So gender-based violence.
Right.
That's your theory.
Right.
Now, for the methodology section, you can either choose to do quantitative methodology. So you can conduct surveys and then you analyze using statistical packages like SPSS, or you can adopt a qualitative method where you conduct interviews with your participants, you ask them questions related to your topic, and then you analyze it qualitatively. Or you can adopt a method where you do both. But whatever method you choose, the point is at the end of the day, your findings will either corroborate or refute or build on the arguments of the theory you've chosen, so feminist theory. So it's a nice distinction.
Yeah, if we go back, just to help people understand, I think another way to look at this is that you use the theory in a way to create your hypothesis.
Yeah, so you can say something like, what are the impacts of what are the impacts of gender-based violence on, say, the mental health of victims?
Okay, and we would see like victims, or I was thinking about court stuff, but anyway, so then you're going to use the feminist theory to
explain.
Think, okay, if I apply this theory, this is the answers it should give me, right? That's what we use the theory for. And then the methodology is like, I'm going to gather real world information and see, does this real world information back up my hypothesis or not? And then if it doesn't, that means I got to go back to the other sociologists and say, hey, this theory we have, it's not working in this particular case. So maybe we need to throw out the theory. Maybe we need to adjust the theory. Maybe we got to add a piece to the theory. So really what you're doing, I think this speaks to people are like, what the heck are academics doing? You know, I think not just sociologists, but anyone in social sciences in particular, they're trying to figure out, how do we explain the world? Yeah. And then they've gone to a camp, they're like, this explanation, I think it is the best for most situations. And then they keep trying to prove or disprove it, refine it, just to try to understand how the world works. And people are like, okay, what's the point of this? And then I think in something like sociology in particular, refining those explanations, backing it up with real world data, like your research, can actually inform policy changes, can inform how we build our particular society. So these are all interlinked. And I think if you're a young person coming in, you might be really passionate about something, you know, that affected you. And you're kind of like, okay, why are we doing this? Like, why are we applying this theory? And, you know, I want to like make the change. So I think it's kind of important to understand, you know, what is the process? What is the purpose of all these? It's not just a professor telling you like, you need to do this. Like there's a reason, and actually it can cause social change by being the source of new ideas. And then someone else is going to take the ideas and implement them. And even then, the sociologist might come along and be like, you know, let me just test that your implementation is working well. And stuff like that. So it's kind of like this process, this back and forth exchange.
Absolutely.
Which I think makes sociology so interesting and powerful. You know, or any of the social sciences, really. I mean, you could do that in economics, you could do it in political science, you can do it in psychology.
Yeah.
Takes a while to write a paper to make that change, but it happens.
Absolutely.
I think that's helpful. And then I think maybe this is good for a later discussion, or something I think students would want to ask you about, because you were kind of talking about quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods. But I know even with the PhD students I work with, you know, methodologies also have values. So in particular, I work with a lot of students who are Indigenous, and in that case, a lot of the traditional academic methods don't work for them. There's different methods, say, for example, related to storytelling and collecting data in the form of stories, because that's more culturally appropriate, say, than doing like a survey. So I think, and this is more of a graduate school thing, I think not really an undergraduate thing, but just that theories and methods are important because it's the way you see the problem, you see the answers to the problem, and you gather the information. And along the way, if you have a bias, which you probably do because you're a human and you have to be aware of these things.
Yep.
As a researcher, you have to become more and more aware. Like, I think, for example, if we look at positivists who were very quantitative, right? And they felt, oh, we just collect all this quantitative data, in a way it's like neutral, but later there's more discussion, like, no, like any sort of data collection isn't really neutral. It's based on like assumptions and values. So I think what I'm trying to get at is that in undergrad, maybe you don't see the point of this. It's just like a lot of things to remember. You know, I'm not doing like some big research project, whatever. But actually, when you read papers for your own research project or books, to sort of like be able to have these things in mind and know that every person doing research is imperfect and is applying their own, as much as they're trying to be aware, there's biases, there's values informing the way they, you know, tackle a question. And that's why it's important to understand different theories and different methods so you can compare and contrast them, and somewhere in there lies the truth. You know, even if you go on to be a professor, I think sometimes academics sometimes get like in one little way of seeing the world, right? But that's how come there's 5 other people that see it differently. Who's right?
Yeah. And I would just say that for students writing a research paper or composing a paper, whenever in doubt, just go back to academic journals or literature in a similar area to what you're studying and read. Usually you would find answers to your questions. If I have a topic and I'm not really sure of what theories to apply or what theories explain what I'm trying to do or provide some sort of explanation, doing an extensive literature review is usually the best way to get out of that, because you see how other people have studied that topic or something similar, and then you can see what theories did they use. Do you think this would apply to what you're trying to do or not? If not, you move on to the next one, and you can always combine theories. There's no reason why it's just one. Likewise for methodology. Okay, so person was studying so topic and used so methods, and there's usually a description. If you pick an academic journal, there's a description of what methods were used, why it was used, and the limitations, the advantages, the disadvantages to using a certain method. So I find that just doing an extensive literature review helps.
Yeah.
And that's usually the easiest way to get out of, it's the easiest way to figuring out like theories and methodology and writing and research papers, and just doing that, just reading what people have written and what people have done.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I know myself and a lot of students that I work with, and this is probably what you also experience as a TA, is they're looking for the answer. And I think what you're describing is that there are a lot of different answers. There's a lot of different ways that people tackled the same question. Yeah. Patterns will emerge in those answers, like what's the most common answer, or what's a kind of way out here answer. You know, so there might be like a better answer, or maybe you don't agree with any of these answers, which I think is more of a graduate school thing. I think in undergraduate, it's more about understanding what are the common answers. But I think just sort of getting out of the high school mindset of like, there's an answer.
Yeah.
And then the goal is actually, no, it's not about getting the right answer. It's about learning how to think through a problem. And also learning how other people thought through the same problem, as you said.
Exactly.
And those literature reviews help. And paying attention to things people often don't when they read a paper, right? They just kind of go to the conclusion. Okay, what's the answer again, right? But actually paying attention to, well, what perspective did they take? How did that influence their answer? What methods are they using? How did that influence their answer? Are there 5 people answering the same question, but they get 5 different answers? Is that because they're using a different theory? Or are they using the same theory, but a different methodology? You know, like these kind of more nuanced things, I think undergraduate students don't think about, but can help you to understand in more depth kind of what sociology is about, or what's happening. So there's 2 kind of things I want to ask you. You kind of mentioned the literature review tip. Do you have any other tip you would give a student who's just going into their first year sociology class? They have to write their first paper. They're really nervous. What would you tell them?
You need to understand what is required of you.
Okay.
If it's an assignment, you need to understand the question.
Mm.
If it's a research paper, you need to understand the expectations. So what type of paper is it? What topic? What's the word count? What's the number of pages expected? If it's an assignment, so what I usually think of is, and this is something I see quite often, or this is something I think is a very helpful tip. In an assignment or an essay, the marks allocated is usually a sign of what is expected from you. If you have a question that is worth 5 marks,
right,
I would give at least 3 major points and explain those points. Because in my head, if it's 5 marks, the person marking probably has a mark for each point I give. Right? So if you ask me a question and it's worth 5 marks, I'm not just going to give 1 point and go away. I'm going to give at least 3 and then explain. So if you're able to give 3 major points and explain them adequately, then I kind of would be able to sleep well, knowing that I've done justice to the question.
Okay.
There's also...
That's a really good tip. Look at the percentage or the grading and kind of think about what are they expecting from me?
Yeah.
What constitutes 5 marks?
Yes. So recently we had it was midterms, and we had a question. It was to list, I think, the 3 roles of schooling, and it was a short answer section. So I can see why people would have thought that just listing the points was enough, but it was worth 6 marks. So if I list the 3 roles of schooling and is worth 6 marks, I think that common sense should tell me that just listing 3 points, just saying, oh, socialization, organization, selecting, bye-bye. That's not enough. It's worth 6 marks. I should at least be able to list each point and provide an explanation for each point. So if listing a point is a mark, and I'm able to correctly list the 3 points, that's already 3 marks. And if I'm able to explain the 3 points, that's another 3 marks. And that's my full 6 points.
Right. This is so you're giving some good exam tips.
And it works. It's helped me. It helped me very well. It works.
Smart. Okay. You talked about the sort of 3 canons of sociology. Is there another book or a few books you might recommend to a student? So say I'm like in high school, going to university, or it's after my first year and I have the summer off. What is kind of like something I must read?
I have 2 books that come to mind. Sociology for Dummies is a very good introductory text. I read it early on. Remember how I said for my undergrad, I really didn't even know what sociology was?
Yeah.
And I just yeah. But then I read Sociology for Dummies, and it was a good introduction.
And that's like those yellow dummies books.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I know it has a questionable title, but it's really a good text if you're just trying to know what this is about. Just a very broad.
And does it give you like good references? So if you wanted to read more about something, you could go read another text or article. So it's a good kind of like reference book.
Yes, it does. And the second one, which is a lot bigger, it's a massive textbook, but in my opinion, it contains almost everything. The title is Sociology, Themes and Perspectives.
Okay.
The authors are Haralambos and Holborn.
Okay.
It's really, I have the 8th edition.
Okay.
Let me see. It's a really big book. It's about 1,098 pages.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you show it to us? Show it to us on the screen. You have it there?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is how big it is. And
okay.
It's really big. But again, it has almost every area you can think of. It has 15 chapters. And you can always just pick a chapter you're interested in.
Yeah.
And then focus on. So I'm not saying read the whole book, but if there's a chapter that you think, and eventually, like if you choose to continue in like sociology, like I come back to this book, even though I've had it since like my undergrad, I come back and I read chapters on other areas and other issues. So it's really good. It's a good text to have.
And again, it probably has really rich bibliography.
It does. Extensively. Yeah, it does.
Okay. Good tip. I think that's a really good recommendations. And even that's a tip is sort of go to those reference books. And I guess even if you're writing a paper on like taking a new kind of course, like you never studied gender for some reason, I don't know why, but you're taking a course specifically on that, and you probably could go to one of those reference books, read a chapter, get the basics, find some sources, start looking up those scholars, and kind of, get more familiar with that topic beyond the stuff in your course.
And you know what you would always find in these chapters? Theories. So for every area, so pick education, pick crime and deviance. If you pick a chapter on a particular area and you go and read the chapter, you would find the relevant theories on that particular area.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point, because there are a lot of theories in sociology. It can be pretty overwhelming.
Yes, there are a lot. So it's also it's a good place to find theories. It's a good place to find methodologies.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for being on our podcast today, Jemimah.
Thank you for having me.
So if anyone wants to find out more about Jemimah, if you're struggling with your sociology class, you can look her up on our website, www.pfau.ca, and reach out to us, and we'll set up some help for you. So everyone else, stay tuned for a short meditation and writing exercise.